Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a man originally from El Salvador, found himself at the center of a complex legal storm in a Nashville, Tennessee courtroom. On June 6, 2025, he stood before a judge to answer to serious federal charges that could change the course of his life forever. The accusations against him were grave conspiracy to unlawfully transport illegal aliens and the unlawful transportation of those same people for financial gain. Abrego, who first came to the United States in 2012 seeking a better life, pleaded not guilty to both felony counts. His case is not just about one man. It is a story that touches on the deep and often painful realities of immigration, justice, and the powerful forces that shape the American dream for so many. The legal battle began long before Abrego entered the courtroom that day. A federal grand jury had secretly indicted him on May 21, 2025, laying the groundwork for his arrest and prosecution. The indictment painted a picture of a long-running operation, alleging that from 2016 to 2025, Abrego was part of a network that moved thousands of undocumented migrants across the country. These journeys, the government claimed, stretched from the Texas border all the way to Maryland. The people being transported were a mix of individuals seeking new lives, including, according to prosecutors, unaccompanied children and even alleged members of the notorious MS-13 gang, a claim his lawyers vehemently deny. The specific event that brought Abrego to the attention of federal authorities was a seemingly routine traffic stop on Interstate 40 in Tennessee back in 2022. He was behind the wheel of an SUV carrying 9 other men. Law enforcement officials at the scene determined that 6 of his passengers were in the United States without legal permission. At the time, the incident seemed minor. No one was held in custody for more than an hour. Yet, this single stop on a busy highway would later become the cornerstone of a major federal case, unspooling a series of events that would see Abrego deported, brought back by a Supreme Court order, and ultimately placed in the defendant's chair. This case represents more than just a legal proceeding. It is a window into the broader, often contentious debate over immigration in the United States. It forces us to look closely at the lives of those who cross borders, the motivations that drive them, and the systems that are in place to manage them. For Abrego, the journey from an asylum seeker to a man facing federal charges has been a long and winding road. His story raises important questions about fairness, the reliability of evidence, and what justice truly looks like for immigrants caught within a system that is often confusing, intimidating, and unforgiving. The prosecution, led by interim U.S. Attorney Robert McGuire, painted a dark and detailed picture of Kilmar Abrego Garcia's alleged activities. They argued that he was not simply giving a ride to a few people, but was a key player in a sophisticated and profitable smuggling conspiracy. McGuire's team told the court that Abrego had made over 100 trips, transporting people who had recently crossed the border illegally. They claimed he was doing this for financial gain, turning human desperation into a business. The government's narrative portrayed Abrego as a calculated operator who knowingly violated federal immigration laws for years, making him a danger to the community and a significant flight risk if released before his trial. A central and deeply troubling part of the prosecution's argument involved the safety of children. Prosecutors made the shocking accusation that Abrego had endangered his own children, 2 of whom have autism, by bringing them along on these alleged smuggling trips. This detail was meant to portray him as a man with little regard for the well-being of even his own family, let alone the strangers he was transporting. Furthermore, the government leveled accusations of a more personal and predatory nature, claiming that Abrego had propositioned underage girls and sought inappropriate photos from a 15-year-old. These allegations, while separate from the smuggling charges, were used to paint a character portrait of Abrego as someone who could not be trusted. To build their case, prosecutors are relying heavily on testimony from informants. These are individuals who have agreed to cooperate with the government, often in exchange for some benefit, such as a lighter sentence for their own crimes. The government's case hinges on what these snitches, as the defense would later call them, have said about Abrego's involvement. The prosecution presented this informant testimony as credible inside information, providing a direct look into the workings of the alleged smuggling ring. They argued that these witnesses could connect Abrego directly to the conspiracy and prove that his actions were organized, repeated, and motivated by money. The government also focused on the 2022 traffic stop as a key piece of evidence. They argued that one of the passengers in Abrego's vehicle was a 15-year-old boy. The presence of a minor, they contended, was a significant factor that should weigh heavily in the decision to keep Abrego detained before his trial. The transportation of an unaccompanied minor is seen as a particularly serious offense, elevating the potential risk and harm involved. For the prosecution, this wasn't just about moving adults. It was about exploiting the vulnerability of a child, which they argued was a clear and compelling reason for the court to deny him bail and ensure he remained in custody. In response to the government's formidable accusations, Kilmar Abrego Garcia's defense attorneys, Dumaka Shabazz and Richard Tennant, launched a vigorous counterattack. They argued that the prosecution's entire case was built on a foundation of unreliable and self-serving testimony. Shabazz described the government's evidence as a house of cards, suggesting that it was a flimsy structure that would collapse under any real scrutiny. He told the court that the case was based almost entirely on the words of snitches, individuals who had strong incentives to lie or exaggerate their stories to please prosecutors and secure better deals for themselves. The defense urged the judge to be skeptical of these second- or third-hand accounts. The defense team directly challenged the credibility of the government's informants. They pointed out that people involved in criminal activities are not always the most trustworthy sources of information. Their testimony, the lawyers argued, could be tainted by personal rivalries, a desire for revenge, or the simple hope of reducing their own prison time. Without solid physical evidence to back up these claims, the defense contended that the government was asking the court to make a life-altering decision based on little more than gossip and innuendo from unreliable sources. They argued that the standard for justice must be higher than simply taking the word of a cooperating witness. Regarding the serious allegations of endangering his children and propositioning a minor, the defense argued that these were inflammatory claims designed to poison the court's opinion of Abrego. They asserted that these accusations were not directly related to the smuggling charges at hand and were being used to prejudice the proceedings. The defense team suggested these were desperate tactics to ensure Abrego would be detained. They strongly denied the allegation that Abrego had ties to the MS-13 gang, framing it as another attempt by the government to paint their client as a dangerous criminal mastermind, rather than a man caught in a difficult situation. The defense also took aim at the government's claim that a 15-year-old was present during the 2022 traffic stop. They argued that the identities and ages collected during such roadside encounters are often unreliable. Undocumented migrants, especially minors traveling alone, frequently have good reasons to misrepresent their age to authorities. A teenager might claim to be an adult to avoid being placed in a juvenile detention facility or to simplify their immigration case. The defense suggested that the government had not definitively proven the passenger was a minor, and that this crucial piece of the prosecution's argument for pretrial detention was therefore built on shaky ground. At the heart of the legal debate in Kilmar, Abrego Garcia's detention hearing was a critical legal distinction: the difference between immigrant smuggling and human trafficking. While these terms are often used interchangeably in public conversation, in the eyes of the law, they are very different crimes with different levels of severity. U.S. Magistrate Judge Barbara Holmes focused heavily on this point, as it had major implications for whether the government could legally hold Abrego in jail before his trial. Understanding this difference is key to understanding the entire case and what was at stake in the courtroom that day. Immigrant smuggling, the crime Abrego is actually charged with, is fundamentally about transportation. It is defined as the act of helping someone cross a national border or move within a country illegally, usually in exchange for money. The key element is that the arrangement is a business transaction, and the person being transported is generally a willing participant. They have paid for a service to get from one place to another. While it is a serious felony, the law views it primarily as a crime against the integrity of the nation's borders. The focus is on the illegal entry, not necessarily on the exploitation of the person being moved. Human trafficking, on the other hand, is a much more severe crime centered on exploitation and coercion. It is a crime against a person. Human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel someone to perform labor, services, or commercial sex acts against their will. The person being trafficked is a victim, not a client. They are being held in a state of modern-day slavery, stripped of their freedom and autonomy. This crime carries far harsher penalties and is treated with greater urgency by the legal system, precisely because it involves the direct violation of a person's fundamental human rights. Judge Holmes repeatedly brought the court's attention back to this distinction. The specific charges against Abrego, conspiracy to unlawfully transport and unlawful transportation for financial gain, fall squarely under the definition of smuggling. The government was trying to argue that his actions were so dangerous, particularly with the alleged presence of a minor, that they warranted pretrial detention, a measure often reserved for more violent crimes or those, like human trafficking, that involve victimizing individuals. The judge questioned whether the government had the legal authority to seek detention based solely on smuggling charges, suggesting the law might not support their request. Abrego was not charged with trafficking, and the judge seemed unwilling to treat him as if he were. The story of Kilmar Abrego Garcia's legal troubles includes a dramatic and unusual chapter that saw him deported from the United States, only to be brought back under the highest legal authority in the land. This strange turn of events began on March 15, 2025, when immigration authorities put him on a plane and sent him back to El Salvador. This action was taken despite a 2019 immigration court order that explicitly barred his removal. That order had been granted because of the very real risk that Abrego would face gang violence if he were returned to his home country. A danger that, honestly, many Salvadorans flee. The Trump administration's handling of the deportation was, well, confusing and contradictory. Initially, officials called his removal an administrative error, suggesting a mistake had been made within the vast immigration bureaucracy. However, the administration's position later shifted. They began to publicly defend the deportation, justifying it by alleging that Abrego had connections to the MS-13 gang. This claim, which his lawyers have consistently and strongly denied, was used to portray him as a threat to public safety, making his removal seem necessary for national security. This back and forth left Abrego's fate hanging in the balance, stranded in the very country he had fled for his safety. Abrego's legal team refused to accept the deportation as a final act. They took his case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that the government had acted unlawfully by ignoring a valid court order. In a rare and decisive ruling on April 10, 2025, the Supreme Court sided with Abrego. In a unanimous 9-0 decision, the justices ordered the Trump administration to facilitate Abrego's immediate return to the United States. This was a significant legal victory, reaffirming the power of court orders and pushing back against the administration's actions. It was a clear message that no government agency is above the law. Even with a direct order from the Supreme Court, the administration did not comply immediately. They resisted, citing state secrets as a reason why they could not bring Abrego back. This move was widely seen as a delaying tactic, but eventually the government relented under the immense legal pressure. They returned Abrego to United States soil, but his return was not a moment of freedom. Instead, he was brought back to face the new federal smuggling charges that had been secretly prepared by the grand jury. His dramatic deportation and court-ordered return set the stage for the high-stakes legal battle now unfolding in Nashville. Throughout the detention hearing, I played a crucial and active role. I didn't just sit back and listen passively to the arguments from the prosecution and the defense. Instead, I carefully questioned both sides, really probing the weaknesses in their positions and focusing, on the letter of the law. My sharp scrutiny was especially directed at the government's case. I expressed significant doubt about whether the prosecution had presented enough solid evidence to justify keeping Kilmar Abrego Garcia locked up before his trial. I made it clear that I needed more than just accusations and informant testimony to make my decision. A major point of concern for me was the government's reliance on the claim that a minor was involved in the 2022 traffic stop. This was, honestly, the prosecution's strongest argument for pretrial detention, because the law takes the endangerment of a child very seriously. But I just wasn't convinced that the government had really proven its case. I acknowledged the defense's point that the names and birth dates collected from undocumented immigrants during a traffic stop can be unreliable. And, well, I seem to agree that a teenager might lie about their age to avoid complications. So I questioned whether the prosecution had done enough to verify the person's identity and age independently. I also repeatedly emphasized the legal difference between immigrant smuggling and human trafficking. I noted that the laws governing pretrial detention are specific, and the charges Abrego faced were for smuggling. I openly questioned whether the government even had the legal authority to ask for detention based on those particular statutes. By doing this, I was signaling that the prosecution might be overreaching, trying to treat a smuggling case like a trafficking case without having actually filed the appropriate charges. My comments suggested I believed the law was pretty clear on this distinction, and I just wasn't inclined to blur the lines. Ultimately, I wanted to convey a sense of caution and a deep respect for due process. I appeared to believe that taking away a person's liberty before they've been convicted of a crime is a really serious step that requires a high burden of proof. My questions indicated that I didn't believe the government had met that burden yet. I didn't make an immediate decision, instead announcing that I would take the arguments under advisement and issue a written ruling soon. My thoughtful and skeptical approach, I think, demonstrated a commitment to ensuring that the final decision would be based on solid legal principles and credible facts, not just suspicion or emotion. While the legal arguments unfolded inside the federal courthouse in Nashville, a totally different kind of drama was taking place on the street outside. As lawyers debated points of law, a crowd of about 100 people gathered to make their voices heard. They were protesters, and they had come to stand in solidarity with Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Their presence, honestly, transformed the courthouse steps into a stage for the larger national conversation about immigration, fairness, and human rights. These demonstrators wanted to make sure that the story of Abrego's case wasn't just confined to the courtroom, but was actually heard by the wider community. The protesters carried handmade signs with powerful messages. Some signs read, "Justice for Kilmar," while others called for due process for all. These slogans reflected a core belief that every person, regardless of their immigration status, deserves to be treated fairly by the justice system. They weren't necessarily arguing that Abrego was innocent of the charges. Instead, they were demanding that the legal process itself be just. They were protesting against what they saw as an overly aggressive prosecution built on weak evidence and a broader political climate that, in their view, demonized immigrants. The rally was a visible reminder that court cases like this one don't happen in a vacuum. They have a real and immediate impact on communities. For the people gathered outside, Abrego's case was symbolic of the struggles faced by many immigrants in the United States. They saw him not as the criminal mastermind the prosecution described, but as a man who was himself a product of a broken immigration system. His story resonated with those who have friends, family, or neighbors who have faced the threat of deportation or have been caught in the complex web of immigration law. The demonstration really highlighted the deep divide in American society over how to handle immigration. While the protesters outside called for compassion and justice, the prosecutors inside were arguing for strict enforcement of the law. This contrast shows the two competing visions for the country's approach to undocumented migrants. One side emphasizes human rights and the context of why people come to the United States, while the other prioritizes border security and the punishment of those who violate immigration laws. Abrego's case became the focal point where these two powerful and often opposing viewpoints collided. Beyond the legal arguments and political debates, the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia reveals a really profound human cost, especially for the children caught in the middle. The prosecution's most striking allegation was that Abrego endangered his own children by taking them on his alleged smuggling trips. Two of his children have autism, a detail that makes the accusation even more distressing. This claim, honestly, forces a difficult question. Could a father knowingly place his vulnerable children in such a risky environment? For the prosecution, the answer was a simple yes, and it was proof of his reckless character and disregard for others. However, the reality for many immigrant families is so much more complex than a simple narrative of good or bad. Parents living in the shadows often face impossible choices. Lacking access to affordable and reliable childcare, a parent might feel they have no option but to bring their children with them, even to work that is dangerous or illegal. Their situation is one of desperation, not malice. While the government presented this as a sign of Abrego's bad character, it could also be interpreted as a reflection of the precarious and difficult life of an undocumented parent trying to provide for his family in a country that offers few support systems. The case also brings to light the vulnerability of unaccompanied minors who cross the border. The prosecution's focus on the alleged 15-year-old passenger highlights a tragic reality of modern migration. Thousands of children travel alone to the United States every year, fleeing violence, poverty, and instability in their home countries. They are incredibly vulnerable to exploitation along the way. Whether the passenger in Abrego's car was a minor or not, his potential presence in that SUV is a reminder that the journey north is filled with peril for young people who often have no one to protect them from harm. Ultimately, the children in this story, Abrego's own and the anonymous migrant teen, are the silent figures whose lives are deeply affected by the actions of adults and the policies of governments. Their well-being is often caught in the crossfire of legal battles and political agendas. Abrego's children face the potential loss of their father to a long prison sentence or deportation. The young migrant and thousands like him face a journey fraught with danger. This case serves as a somber reminder that behind the headlines and court documents are real families and children whose futures hang precariously in the balance. The legal battle of Kilmar Abrego Garcia is, honestly, far more than the story of one man's alleged crimes. It serves as a powerful illustration of the immense challenges and deep-seated tensions at the heart of the American immigration system. This single case brings together many of the most contentious issues of our time: the enforcement of border security, the rights of undocumented individuals, the reliability of the justice system, and the very human drama of people seeking a better life. What happens in this Nashville courtroom will have ripple effects, sending a message about what justice looks like for immigrants in the United States today. This case forces a critical examination of the tools and tactics used by law enforcement and prosecutors. The government's heavy reliance on informants, or snitches, raises fundamental questions about fairness and the integrity of the evidence. When a person's freedom is at stake, should it depend on the testimony of individuals who might be lying to save themselves? My careful questioning of the evidence and focus on the legal distinction between smuggling and trafficking really highlight the importance of judicial oversight in protecting individual rights against potential government overreach. This case is a test of whether the system can resist pressure to secure a conviction at all costs. For immigrant communities across the country, the Abrego case is being watched with a mixture of fear and hope. A conviction based on what some see as flimsy evidence could create a chilling effect, making immigrants even more vulnerable to accusations and less likely to trust the legal system. On the other hand, a decision that upholds a high standard of proof and respects due process could reinforce the idea that justice is possible for everyone, regardless of their background or immigration status. The outcome will signal how the courts are navigating the intense political climate surrounding immigration. In the end, the story of Kilmar Abrego Garcia is a microcosm of a much larger national drama. It's a story about how a nation of immigrants treats the newcomers who arrive at its borders today. It asks us to consider whether our laws are applied fairly, whether our system values compassion as much as it values control, and whether we can find a path forward that honors both the rule of law and our shared humanity. The final verdict in his case will be written into the ongoing story of America, a chapter that will tell us something important about the kind of country we are and the kind of justice we are willing to provide.